Great pleasure that I call the honourable member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Very kind. In regards to the member for Melbourne's contribution from the Greens, very good but not quite what we're after. As a former member of the Victorian Police Force, this week I had the great pleasure on Monday night to meet with the current serving presidents and secretaries of all police associations across Australia. In particular, I had a great chat with the current president of the Victorian Police Association, John Laird, and also Ron Eddles, who's the secretary. For those who don't know Ron Eddles, in Victoria Police Force, he's a bit of a legend because he's worked so many years at the Homicide Squad and done such great work. And the conversation we had was a bit about the bill we're now talking about metadata. And like he said, we've been using it for 20 years, and we have. As a former police officer, I've been heavily involved in using what we call metadata. There's a term in the police force which most detectives across the country would know, and that's CCRs and reverse CCRs. Most members of Parliament probably never heard that term. Most members of the public would have never heard that term. A CCR is a call charge record. What that means is when a person makes a phone call, that's regarded as the person they're calling is a call charge record. So it's from the person making the call, that's what is regarded as a call charge record. It identifies who they've called. Then we have reverse CCRs, or reverse call charge records, and that's obviously when the phone calls are coming into that person. And the legislation has been in this country that telecommunication providers have kept this information for 6 months. So the police forces around the country and law enforcement have been using this for year after year. The difference now is we're looking at changing it for the period they need to hold on to that information from 6 months to 2 years. And the reason is, when I speak to law enforcement, is because of the complexity with, in particular, terrorism cases. For example, September 11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he was one of the main instigators and planners for that. That was planned over a number of years. That wasn't something which just happened overnight. It was planned for a number of years, and that's why they need this information. To give it an understanding of personally how valuable I've found CCRs, I go back to my time in the organised crime squad. In our unit, we'd received a file, and the file was relating to drug crops discovered at Mount Disappointment. The file actually came from the Internal Investigations Department, and they demanded a big investigation, believing, sad as it may be, that there may have been some corrupt police officers involved in this crop. Why? Because the week or two just before the Special Operations Group were planning to arrest those on site, no offenders ever came back. So we got the file. So the first thing they did is they supplied the Internal Investigations Department their potential suspects, etc. So we went through those. In actual fact, our analyst went through those, and it was actually Tracy O'Neill, who is a very good analyst. And what we tried to do is work out potentially who could be basically involved in this. We had the targets, as we said. So we started undertaking call charge records, looking at those, the potential suspects who they'd been calling. And interestingly enough, one government department came up, and that was the park ranger at Mount Disappointment. So then what we then did reverse call records on the park ranger and found out that, in actual fact, all the targets, everyone potentially involved had been calling him. Was at that time we realised he was our main suspect, and so what happened is obviously other police tools went on, surveillance and all those other issues, and that ended up resulting in people being imprisoned and breaking up a drug cartel. When it comes to the warrants, and here the member from Melbourne, he talks about warrants. Well, I've taken out warrants for telecommunication intercept devices. And it's not an easy thing to take out a warrant. You have to provide a hell of a lot of information when it comes to an affidavit to prove the case. When you're going to, I know the member for Melbourne's going to say, well, everyone should remain be innocent until proven guilty, and I accept that. But at the same time, too, with the CCRs and reverse CCRs, all this is looking at is the link to potentially if a person's made a phone call. Now, everyone should realise that your own telecommunication provider keeps on record who you've been making telephone calls to. So the difference, especially for this, will be changing from 6 months to 2 years when it comes to telephone calls. Sadly, Australia is now in the grasp of a terrorism threat. The government has raised our national terrorism public alert level from medium to high. The advice is not based on knowledge of a specific plan, but rather a body of evidence that points to an increased likelihood of terrorist attacks in Australia. A terrorist attack, and this is defined in the Criminal Code of 1995, a terrorist act is an act or threat to commit an act that is done with the intention to coerce or influence the public or any government by intimidation to advance a political, religious or ideological cause, and that act causes death, serious harm or endangers a person, serious damage to property, a serious risk to health or safety of the public, and serious interferes and destroys critical infrastructure protection, such as a power supply. And it's interesting to note that when we first actually wrote this speech, in that time, sadly, we've had 2 incidents. We've had the incident in Melbourne where police officers were stabbed by a terrorist, sadly a very young man who'd been influenced by extremists, and also what we saw with the Lint Cafe up in Martin Place in Sydney. Now, that was a classic example of putting fear and anxiety in the public. We then go back to days gone by when in 1978 we had the bombing explode outside the Hilton Hotel, and that was in regard to an awful incident which took place, and those 2 garbage collectors, Alec Carter and William Farrell, they were killed in that, and also police officer Paul Brimstraw died later from the injuries he received. Now, of course, we've had the other incidents, such as the Bali bombings and planes flying into World Trade Centre, and I'll just take up the member for Melbourne another point. He's kind of half right. Not every criminal is the smartest criminal around there. For example, the Australian embassy bombings in Jakarta. The video footage shows the person who subsequently rammed with a truck to basically a truck laden with explosives. He actually drove around 2 or 3 times. Why? Because sadly for him and for those there, he was the mule who didn't even know how to drive a car, so he drove around 2 or 3 times before crashing into it. And as I've said, terrorism attacks are still occurring. And since 1978, communications have dramatically improved. The internet in all forms now plays a big part in gaining groups of radical and disenfranchised people together to terrorise others. Some of the tools of terror have become more sophisticated, although beheadings of people with simple knives still have the desired impact. We've all seen on the media public beheadings. It's absolutely disgraceful and tragic. And one of the roles of law enforcement is to ensure we have all the tools in the toolbox to protect Australian citizens. And also, in the case, God forbid, there is another terrorist attack in Australia, the police have the ability to track down those responsible. And as I've said, and you look at, for example, Al-Qaeda, most of their terrorist attacks, they spend years in planning. Very crucial that metadata is stored in this country to ensure the police have those tools. The other situation which is now occurring, tragically, we have young Australians travelling over to Syria and Iraq and joining Daesh and becoming terrorists. At least 60 of these fighters have actually returned to Australia, and obviously this puts great stress and pressure on police to monitor those. Now, the bill we're looking at today regarding metadata, and I'll explain a bit about metadata. The best way to explain is the use of a telephone call between two people. And as an example, the metadata of the phone call between the two people could include the following information: the two telephone numbers, the time and length of the phone call, locations of people making the phone calls. The actual conversation is not recorded. The police, to get that information, must take out a warrant. And as I've said before, to take out a warrant for this, it has to go before a Supreme Court judge. It's a very, very extensive affidavit, and I've sat down at the Organised Crime Squad and put these together. It takes weeks and weeks to achieve. And that brings me to another point. Quite often when detectives all of a sudden understand that you may have potential suspects in case, they can't wait 2 weeks to get this information. They need, and the way it works, I know unless it's changed in Victoria Police, the members put a request that goes before a detective inspector who looks at the information and why it's required and will make the order if appropriate. And at the same time too, if someone is charged, it will go before the courts and everything comes out in the court. How did the police get that information? Now, on the internet, every machine attached to it has a unique number, just like a telephone number. The number is called an Internet Protocol address, or the IP address for short. For machines on the internet talk to each other, they need to have a unique IP address, similar to a telephone number. In this case, the metadata, the data on the internet connected machines could include the two IP addresses of machines communicating with each other, the start and the length of the internet connection on the machines, the location of the machines connecting via the internet, the names of the people allocated to the IP address of the machines, the email addresses used on the two machines if an email is used, internet-connected machine visitor logs in chat room sessions. And can I say that is so important, the chat room sessions, because you find with pedophile groups and others involved in terrorism, they go into a cyber world where they have these communications taking place. Now, it doesn't mean everyone involved in these is going to be a terrorist or pedophile, but at the same time too, this information may become vital to police investigation down the track when they're looking at who has visited a certain chat rooms, and it gives them that start of an investigation, and that is just so vital. The email connect or the subject, that chat room's conversation, the input on the data to the software application is not captured. So the conversation's not captured, it's just where they have been in the chat room. It doesn't disclose where they browsed either. It's also an important thing to also remember, this bill expressively includes information relating to web browser activities being stored as metadata. And just summing up, I did hear that Minister Malcolm Turnbull spoke in his second reading impacts of not keeping appropriate metadata, not limited to law enforcement agencies in Australia during the recent Europol child exploitation investigation. Child exploitation investigations relied heavily on access to telecommunications metadata as perpetrators primarily shared information online, meaning that physical evidence was rarely available. 371 suspects were believed to be in the United Kingdom. Using related metadata, UK authorities were able to positively identify 240 suspects, leading to 121 arrests and convictions. And at the same time in Germany, 377 suspects were believed to be involved. Because they didn't have metadata, sadly they won't be able to attract the offenders. And when it comes to issues of pedophilia and terrorism, I'm sure every member in this place believes those people should be imprisoned, and to make that happen, the police need the tools to ensure this does place. And just finally, they do already have access to metadata. It's just an extension from the 6 6 months to 2 years. So I fully support this legislation. Thank you.